Hello everyone, Rebecca here from Stocking My Pantry, and this video is all about how to dehydrate grapes. I'm going to take you step by step through the process of how to prepare grapes for dehydrating and also show you what it looks like each step along the way. I'll show you the finished product, how they turned out, and my thoughts on whether or not I would do this again. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the thing about grapes is that they have a skin on the outside, and if you just throw them into the dehydrator without breaking the skin, the outside will dry. It will become hard, and the inside will never dry no matter how long you dehydrate them. This is known as case hardening. You don't want it to happen because then the grapes or whatever it is that you're dehydrating, if you haven't broken the skin with that have this problem, they will get hard and they'll never dry on the inside, and then they will go bad in storage because there will still be moisture locked on the inside. So there's basically three ways that you can break the skin for preparing grapes for dehydrating. The first way is to boil them. You're going to want to bring a pot of water to a boil, and then you put the grapes into the water. Now, one great tip that is in this book is that you want to leave the grapes on the stems. Okay, and the reason for that is because that helps the juice that's in the grapes not to go out. If you pulled the grapes off the stems and threw them in the boiling water, they would lose a lot of the juice, and so of course a lot of the flavor and all of that. So you leave them on the stems. Then you boil them for just under a minute, and then you're going to remove them. I used this big slotted ladle. I don't really know what the right word for it is, but anyway, I use this to scoop the grapes out of the boiling water, and then I just put them into a bowl to cool. Once they've cooled, then you can remove them from the stems and put them on dehydrator trays and dehydrate them whole. So that's one way to do it. So the next way to do it is to cut them in half. And actually, you could slice them, but as I mentioned, dehydrated food shrinks up a lot, and I thought they would just shrivel down to nothing if I slice them. So I chose to cut them in half. So that's another way that you can prepare grapes for dehydrating, and it really didn't take a lot of time to cut them in half. Okay? Now, the third way is to poke holes in the grapes. You could get a toothpick or whatever. I didn't even attempt that way because the thought of going through all these grapes and poking holes in them, it was just too much. So I recommend boiling them for about a minute or cutting them, and obviously both ways will break the skin. Okay, now let's talk about the temperature for dehydrating grapes. Again, this is my reference book for dehydrating, and it recommends 125 degrees Fahrenheit. And I would say that that works fine. That's what I did. But I think you could go up to 135 degrees. I wouldn't go any higher than 135 degrees. But if you want to go by what an expert says, I would say 125 degrees. As you'll see, the grapes take quite a while to dehydrate. Now, according to this book, that it takes about 24 hours for the grapes to dehydrate. You'll find out how long it actually took for me as we go through this process. So I want to now show you the actual process. We're going to look at how the grapes looked various steps along the way. So we'll first look at what the grapes look like after 3 hours in the dehydrator. And we'll start off by looking at the half grapes. Now you can see that around the edges look a little bit different, and there was kind of like a dry looking layer on top. I didn't touch them at this point because they were obviously still very, very moist. Okay, and here's a close-up picture to give you a better idea of what they look like after 3 hours in the dehydrator. Okay, now let's take a look at the whole grapes. And you can see the main thing that you see with whole grapes after 3 hours in the dehydrator is that the outside started just to wrinkle up just a bit. And by the way, in case I forget to mention later, over on the right, you're going to see some red grapes that look more smushed up. When I was boiling the grapes, I thought, after a minute, I didn't really see a lot of skin splitting or anything like that. So I just put in a few red grapes to be able to differentiate between them, and I boiled them longer for about 2 minutes, and that's why those look more smushy. So here's a little bit of a close-up of what the grapes look like after 3 hours. The whole grapes look like after 3 hours in the dehydrator. Okay, so obviously they weren't anywhere close to being dry. I didn't expect them to be. So I popped them back into the dehydrator and I took them out 3 hours later. And now we're going to take a look at what they were like after 6 hours in the dehydrator. Okay, so after 6 hours in the dehydrator, they were still very moist, but I was seeing some progress. Here's what the half grapes look like. In some ways, they look similar. When I first took them out, I was like, do these really look even different than they did after 3 hours in the dehydrator? But one thing that I wanted to do is show you a side-by-side comparison of what the grapes look like after 3 hours in the dehydrator compared to after 6 hours. On the left, we have the grapes that were cut in half that had been in the dehydrator for 3 hours, and on the right are the ones that had been in the dehydrator for 6 hours. Now, if you look at the ones that had been in the dehydrator for 6 hours, you can see that the edges are curling up and the middle of the grapes are kind of sinking in. So there is actually quite a difference between 3 hours and 6 hour mark of the grapes in the dehydrator, the half grapes. Now I want to take a look at the whole grapes, what they look like after 6 hours in the dehydrator. Now, in many respects, I feel like I saw less progress with the whole grapes than I did with the half ones. But let's go ahead and take a look at those side by side. And you can see that they are shriveling up. The ones on the left were after 3 hours, and the ones on the right after 6 hours. So they are making progress. But I'm telling you, these were just, taking forever. At least that's how it felt. But again, going into dehydrating with realistic expectations, this book said 24 hours. It had only been 6 hours. So that was 25% of the way through, And so let's take a little bit of a close-up look at what they look like after 6 hours. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the red grapes that I had boiled longer are kind of smushing up more. They're kind of shriveling up more. And at this point, I kind of wished that I had boiled the other grapes longer, but stay tuned for my thoughts on it as it progresses. But anyway, I even actually thought about smushing them with a fork or something just to kind of break them up a little bit more to help them along, but I didn't do that. I wanted to just follow the instructions. And the red ones I boiled longer because I wanted to be able to compare what they turn out like. Okay, so needless to say, I popped them back into the dehydrator. I waited 4 more hours, and we're going to take a look at what they look like after 10 hours in the dehydrator. So now here are the grape halves after 10 hours in the dehydrator. Again, you can see the edges are curled up. The centers are beginning to kind of like cave in more. They are still very moist, but I'm seeing like, okay, this is starting to work. It's starting to give me a little bit of hope. Now with the whole grapes, again, I was seeing some progress, and I wanted to show you a close-up of the whole grapes after 10 hours in the dehydrator. Now you can see these are, they still have a long way to go, but they're starting to look like raisins. So I'm like, whew, yes. And that was, the green ones were really making good progress, even though I hadn't boiled them as long. Okay, so at this point, it was time for me to go to bed. Now, that's one thing with dehydrating is it does take a long time, typically, depending on what you're doing. But with this being a 24-hour or more project, you're going to have to sleep at some point. That's no problem. Don't turn off your dehydrator. You don't want your dehydrator to sit with half dehydrated food in it. go ahead and let it run overnight. So that's what I did. So it was about 20 hours in was when I checked the next time. And I wanted to show you, this is what the half grapes look like after 20 hours. Okay, so obviously they're changing color, they're darkening. Here's a close-up. You can see they look quite a bit different than they had. And the half grapes were very, very close to being completely dehydrated. They were still a little bit sticky, and at the end I'm going to tell you how to test to make sure they're completely dehydrated. But I wasn't confident that they were completely dehydrated, that they were at the point where they needed to be. And especially since I was going to have to keep dehydrating the whole grapes longer, I just left the half grapes in there. And so anyway, that's what I did. Now here are the whole grapes after 20 hours in the dehydrator. See, now here's what's interesting. As you can see up there near the top, some have not shrunk down very much at all. They were obviously larger grapes. But you can see how some of the other ones were starting to look more like raisins. And again, there at the bottom are the red grapes that I had boiled longer. And so they're progressing a little bit better. But at the same time, not enough that, you know, by this point I'm thinking it was okay that I didn't boil the green ones, you know, super long. Okay, again, there's another close-up of the whole grapes after 20 hours in the dehydrator. Okay, now one tip, and I think that this is a great tip that's in this book, is that she says dehydrate. I'm going to just bring this up so you can see it. Dehydrate for 18 hours and then transfer the partially dehydrated grapes to clean, dry dehydrator sheets. Dehydrate for another 6 hours. Now, her tip on this says that when you put them onto clean dehydrator sheets after 18 hours, they're, you know, it won't be so sticky. Starting with clean ones will help them to dehydrate faster. Now, I didn't have enough of the Kasori dehydrator sheets, but I did have some silicone mesh things that I had actually bought for some other projects, but they are food safe. So anyway, I cut them to fit my dehydrator trays and put them on. And then I just transferred the raisins, well, they're kind of becoming raisins at this point, the grapes to the clean ones. Now, she said to do it after 18 hours. For me, it was after 20 hours simply because I had gone to bed. All right, so anyway, at the 20-hour mark, I popped them back into, after putting all of them, including the whole grapes, onto fresh, clean dehydrator sheets, I popped them back into the dehydrator. Okay, now after 24 hours, the half grapes were completely dehydrated. They were hard, but still a little bit chewy, but they were very dry. When I dropped them on a plate, they kind of made a loud clink sound, and so I felt confident. Also, the testing for it, I'll just go ahead and tell you now, is to kind of squeeze them together in your hand and to see if they stick together, and they did not. Okay, so the whole grapes still had a ways to go, and so I popped them back in. And here's what they look like after 24 hours in the dehydrator. Now, I have this one grape in the center because you can see it's bigger and it's more gooey looking. And so I had a few larger grapes that they still were not done at 28 hours in. But what I decided to do, I just ate those because it didn't make sense to me to run the dehydrator for another 6 hours or whatever or however long it would take for, I think I had maybe 6 grapes that were real plump like that. And so the rest of them were done well enough. I put them in my hand, I squeezed them together, and they weren't sticking together. One thing I also did is I put them into jars, just canning jars with like plastic lids on them. Basically, same thing as what this. and I let them sit out on my counter. And by the way, I want to just mention that let things cool down all the way. Let them sit for, 5 minutes or so before you put them into jars, because the heat can cause some condensation in the jars, and you don't want that. But anyway, I just let them sit out on the counter for a few days. I think I did about a week, because since this was my first time dehydrating grapes, I wasn't exactly sure what to expect. I shook them, made sure they didn't stick together, made sure there were no signs of moisture. This is known as conditioning, and it's something worth doing. So anyway, that is what ended up happening. Again, this book says it takes 24 hours. It took 28 hours for my whole grapes to completely dehydrate. Now I want to talk about whether or not I would do this again. Like I said, you can buy raisins from the store. I have to say though, these were definitely better. The long time for dehydrating, especially I live in the state of California, and electricity is very expensive here. I'm not sure that I would go through the process unless I had just a ton of grapes and I needed to do something with them like I did this time, and so I preserved them in multiple ways. They are, if you want to make sure that your snacks don't have any weird preservatives or things like that, then it's definitely a way to go. But in the future, I would probably be more apt to make grapefruit leather, which I will put out another video showing that process. In the meantime, I'll just show you this photo. It was delicious. It's like eating candy. And so it's funny because it's like my mom, who's 93, my husband, and I, we loved eating this. So we're like little kids, I guess. But anyway, so I definitely recommend that. And I already do have a video on how to can grapes, so you might want to check that out as well. I'll be sure to link to that. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you would like the video, and if you haven't already done so, if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.